Good morning, everyone. My name is Max Pragnell, and I am the cyber practice leader for Gallagher Caribbean. I sit within a team called IIB Re, and we are a reinsurance and wholesale broker just around the corner in the Panjam building. And we work with clients across the Caribbean, so English-speaking islands, as well as other insurance brokers to find solutions for their cyber risks. I've been with Gallagher, as David mentioned, for about 7 years now. I started in Chicago and then London, and then as of last year, I joined the Caribbean. I'm originally from Jamaica, but all that traveling probably gives you a good idea why my accent is so confusing. So we work with companies of all different sizes, all different industries, so small to medium businesses in tech, in hospitality, retail, manufacturing, up to the bigger conglomerates and financial institutions. And my topic today is, cyber insurance and how it intertwines with the Data Protection Act. This isn't going to be, the classic boring conversation about insurance, property or car insurance. I think this is a very topical product. It's very new in the cyberspace and really caught relevance over the past few years. And it's got huge utility, so big protection for companies' balance sheets. And relative to the US, Canada, and Europe, it's also got very low penetration in the Caribbean. So today I'm going to go over a few things. I'm going to talk about what's at risk, especially from a financial perspective and cyber insurance perspective. I'm going to go over what cyber insurance is, what coverages are typically involved, and some claims examples. And then on to the topic of today, so how it responds to Jamaica's data protection sort of regulatory landscape. And then finally, what security controls are actually needed to get cyber insurance, because it's not as easy as companies think nowadays. A few years ago, it was just a few binary questions. Do you have multi-factor authentication? Yes, no. Now companies or insurance companies in London and US, they think very carefully as to what the cybersecurity posture of these companies. And I'll go into detail on what that looks like. So what's at risk? Here on the left, I have some sort of, the big risks for companies from a financial perspective, especially from a cyber insurance perspective. And on the right, I have core motivations of the attacks that we see in the industry. So first is external help. When companies are on the end of an attack or have some sort of outage, they have to bring in external help. That could be, a forensics team to find out what happened, how it happened, and how to get rid of the problem. It could be a ransomware negotiator, a breach coach, so an attorney, data restoration professionals, and these consultants come in and they can cost up to $200 to $600 an hour. And believe me, these are not overnight fixes, so they can be very significant costs to companies. The second is reputational damage, one we've heard a lot today. So how many companies, how many customers, will lose trust in my company? And now, will I lose any of them? Will I be seen as untrustworthy? There's also lost revenue. So, how many deliveries did I fail on? And how many, what was my additional expense to get back up and running? The additional expenses. So I'll go into examples of what that coverage looks like. There's also litigation. So, defense and settlement and bringing in an attorney to help you with those costs. And then regulatory action, which I'll explain on in the end. So from a core motivational perspective, so the core motivations on the right, we're all very familiar with financial gain, the reason why attackers do what they do. In Jamaica, we're all familiar with the scammers going all the way up the corporate ladder. But there are much bigger groups at play, including ransomware groups. So the likes of Hive, Lockbit, Conti. Conti was disbanded last year, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and we saw examples of these attacks in the Caribbean. And it's a huge risk to our companies. But there's also a competitive advantage. So we've seen in the industry attacks, sort of stemming from people wanting to see, trade secrets or formulas or different design processes. There's also personal agenda. So a company may be on the end of an attack because that attacker has some sort of prejudice, or they have this belief that this company is aligned with a political party, or it could be retaliatory. And I'll give an example of that towards the end. And then the challenge itself, we're all familiar with that cliche picture of, of a hacker in the dark with his hoodie on, his or her hoodie on. But sometimes people just do it for the rush of it. So what is cyber insurance? We've seen in the headlines over the past few years that X company was breached, that another company's operations were brought to a halt, that another company's sensitive information was posted on the dark web. And I think when we think of insurance, C-suite executives often ask the question, what is my building worth, or what's my fleet of vehicles worth? But they don't ask the question, what's the value of my employee's password? What's the value of human error in my company? So an employee mistake. Believe it or not, about 80% of cyber insurance claims, they stem from human error. And finally, what is the value of my company's responsibility to other people's data? So here I've just got as a rule of thumb, sort of the core traditional coverages within cyber insurance. It very much depends on the insurance company itself, because they all have different types of appetites. So some may prefer financial institutions, some may prefer tech, and the wording may change, but for the sake of this presentation, these are the sort of core coverages that are on the table. So the first is incident response. As I mentioned, that team of consultants that come in to help you deal with a breach. And these are pre-contracted with insurance companies. So this, again, could be a breach coach. It could be a digital forensics team, ransomware negotiator. It could be a public relations team, credit monitoring teams, and they are all pre-contracted with the insurance company. So if you're on the end of a breach, you would be able to start communicating with these experts immediately. And as I mentioned, those costs could, really amount to big ones, considering the going rates of their hourly charges. The second is business interruption. So this would be covering lost revenues as well as additional expenses to get you back up and running and operate as usual if you are on the end of an attack or an outage. There's also contingent business interruption. So if you rely on a managed service provider or any sort of outsourced tech provider, if they are on the end of a breach and you suffer lost revenues and additional expenses as a result of that, that's where that coverage kicks in. There's regulatory fines, which I'll speak to in a minute, but also PCI fines. So if you're processing credit card information, you have to comply with the payment card industry. And that can be, you could be subject to fines if you're in breach of those. And again, those are insurable, sort of depending on the insurance company, but generally they are. And then finally, there's extortion. So, this is the classic example of a ransomware attack. If a group goes in and encrypts your network, they ask for a payment in Bitcoin, for example. If you don't pay that, then they will release your information on the dark web. Extortion coverage can help you pay towards that, that Bitcoin payment if it's deemed recommended by that ransomware negotiator, and as long as it's from a sort of non-sanctioned territory. So the first section are the first-party coverages, so what's incurred by your company directly, and then the second section is third-party coverages, so costs incurred by other individuals or companies that are then you would be liable to. So privacy liability, that would be, defense costs and settlements and costs associated with attorneys to help you defend those individuals or companies who are suing you for, having their data compromised. There's also network security liability. So that is more geared towards if you were seen as not having taken the right steps to protect your network, that sort of same principle applies where defense costs and settlement would be covered. Media liability. Media liability is more geared towards companies who are actively engaged on social media. So this could be defense for plagiarism or copyright or defamation, for example. Finally, computer crime and funds transfer fraud. This one I have it as a separate section because it can either be its own policy or an extension to a cyber policy. And what this is coverage for that traditional phishing attempt where someone maybe impersonates your accounting team, tells you you need to fund or wire your funds to an address which is fraudulent, it's unrecoverable, and that's where that coverage kicks in. So I received many applications. I have received many applications over the past few years. And unfortunately, a lot of those companies have already been through the process of a breach. That's not necessarily a bad thing because insurance companies, they look at these companies and say, well, they've been through it before, so they should be prepped for another one. But I implore all companies to be more proactive and to think of this sort of balance sheet protection and external help before it's too late. And so now I'm just going to go through some quick examples of what these insurance claims look like. And these are Gallagher clients. So I'm not going to name any companies by name, nor am I going to point to any Caribbean companies, but Gallagher, we have dealt with a number of different claims and different breaches. So this was a Canadian client of ours, a manufacturer, and they came in to their offices one day, found that they had the ransomware demand on their screens encrypted, and they had to pay that $5 million Bitcoin payment. Otherwise, their sensitive information was going to be posted on the dark web. The client correctly, reported it to the insurer, as is recommended and part of the policy. They wanted to make that payment, and but the insurance company had to make sure it complied with sanctions, right? If a ransomware group is operating out of North Korea or Russia, and they are deemed to be operating from that region, as with any country, you're not allowed to be, funding their operations because they're a sanctioned territory. In this case, the ransomware payment was deemed insurable, and that incident response team had that ransomware negotiator bring that $5 million demand down to about $350,000, and they paid it. They decrypted the network and then did all the other work afterwards, to restore their systems. This was a US client of ours, a trucking company. And the firm's director was in correspondence with the accounting team about a tax liability bill of about $178,000. Shortly after, the director received an email saying that the address had changed, and they had made three $50,000 payments to this new address, all unrecoverable. And had this insurance not been in place, it would have been a huge dent to the bottom line of this company. And I have seen examples in the Caribbean where these costs are much more than what's listed here. I personally have seen examples in excess of $1 million US. So a credit union, also in the US on the East Coast, I don't think this was a Gallagher client, but it did catch wind in the insurance industry. And to my point on attacks stemming from a personal agenda, this was a disgruntled employee who took retaliatory action because they were fired. They decided to delete 21,000 files, 3,500 directories, totaling 21 gigabytes of customer data. Now, the incident response team, so that those contractors that I mentioned came in to help with the problem, dealt with those hourly rates, and they helped restore the data as best as they could. So onto regulatory coverage. Believe it or not, there is coverage for sort of the DPA in some shapes and forms, and as everyone's mentioned, it's very similar to the GDPR. So this is a very useful tool for companies that operate in countries where there is a stricter regulatory landscape. We have clients in Cayman and Barbados, which they also see the huge value on responding to regulatory investigation. So here I just have an example from one insurance company in London on what this sort of coverage looks like, and how they explain the coverage in responding to regulatory investigation. So this could be costs associated with obtaining legal advice, so an attorney. It could be costs associated with privacy breach notification letters. It could be email templates, but there are professional groups that day in, day out work on these types of incidents. Again, costs to notify the regulatory body, costs to respond to any regulatory investigation, defend regulatory action. So again, defense costs and settlement. And then finally, fines and penalties resulting from a regulatory investigation. But there is a caveat to that, which I'll explain in just a second. So the same insurance company defines regulatory investigation as a formal hearing, official investigation, an examination, inquiry, legal action, or any other similar proceeding from a regulatory body. And so on that previous slide, so the costs associated with responding to regulatory investigation. Now, to my point on fines and penalties, generally what is considered insurable are compensatory fines. What are not covered are punitive and criminal fines. As is the case in any other line of insurance, much like fraud, the exclusion for fraud in an insurance policy, that goes against public interest and cannot be insured. So where the fines are outside or deemed lawful, that is where the insurance company can step in to help with any sort of regulatory fines. So finally, I'd just like to go over, and I think this is going to be a good transition into the conversations in the afternoon, on what it takes from a cybersecurity posture to get cyber insurance. As I mentioned a few years ago, it was very easy to get cyber insurance, but nowadays underwriters they have a laser focus and pay close attention to the cybersecurity posture. So the first is multi-factor authentication. This is usually a threefold requirement. The first being employee email. So, Office 365, they want to make sure if you're logging in from a remote location or using a new device that you have that multi-factor authentication prompt. There's also remote access. So if you use a VPN or RDP, it's really up to you guys to define what remote access to the network is. They want to make sure that's protected by multi-factor authentication. And the third one is privileged access. So if you have a system admin or domain admin, they want to make sure that that's protected by MFA. The second one is patch management. So they want to make sure that you are fixing critical patches within a certain period. Usually that's 7 days. They want to make sure that they have, or companies have, endpoint detection and response. So vendors like SentinelOne, they want to make sure that you have that sort of behavioral technical tool to tell you if you have unusual behavior in the network or on your endpoints being your phones, your laptops, your servers. Data backups, and to the point of lost revenues, they want to make sure that you are able to get back up and running as quickly as you can. Data backups, what they usually look for from a criteria perspective is, is it air gapped? Do you encrypt your backups? Do you use the cloud? And then finally, employee training. So this is usually geared towards phishing simulations. And I know common providers for that could be like KnowBe4, where you are, training your employees across the board to make sure that they are not clicking on things that they shouldn't be. So that's the end of my presentation.